Good morning. Good morning. I trust you've all had a good week. And it's been an exciting week. Kind of miss the meetings being over, don't you? I really enjoyed the series on Islam versus Christianity. Do I need to punch anything here, turn anything on, or I'm okay? Well, today marks the close of the series we started back in the spring on the Exodus experience and how it applies to our day. I hope you've enjoyed the series, listening as much as I have in preaching this series. Actually, it was an 8-day revival series that I did, well, I don't know how many years ago. 20, but who's counting? But the lessons that apply are as relevant today as they were not just 20 years ago, but 3,000 years ago. The fundamental characteristic of truth is its consistency. Would you not agree? Truth is always truth. It never changes. In the face of every known and unknown fact, truth remains the same. Never changes. It's final. It's absolute. Circumstances can never change truth. If circumstances compel you to rethink previous conclusions, if honesty in the light of new information compels you to change your convictions, it does not mean that truth has changed. It simply means that you simply never knew the truth before. Circumstances and additional information are only forcing you to recognize that fact. In his prayer to his Father on behalf of those who would believe on him, not only then, but after he had returned to heaven, Jesus said, "Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth." John 17 and verse 17. Truth, my friends, is not academic. Truth is more than an absolute or ultimate principle in life. Truth is the very person of God himself, because the Word became flesh. That Word which is truth. That Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John tells us in the first chapter of his gospel. Jesus, my friend, is truth in action. He was the truth. He is the truth. And he will always be the truth. Jesus is the final exegesis of truth. Obedience to that truth, that person who has offered to dwell within the human heart, identifies that believer instantly with Jesus. Jesus said, "Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice." John 18:37. He also said, "If you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." You see, to know Jesus is to know truth. I hear a lot of people use the remark that so-and-so came into the truth. That's a phrase that's frequently heard in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And by that, most of the time they mean that they have come to understand the 28 fundamental doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist truth. Not so, my friends. Truth is more than a set of doctrinal statements. Truth is coming into a relationship and knowing the person of Jesus. Because it's Jesus, the truth, who sets you free. Man's spiritual emancipation takes place when he returns to truth. It's always been that way. That is to say that when man returns to God, he becomes obedient to God's laws, as God makes those laws known to him through the study of his word. Only by obeying God's laws does man begin to live as God designed him to live. We may ignore God's laws. We may depart from God's laws. We may manipulate God's laws somehow to excuse our behaviors. But my friends, God's laws never change. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's the most fundamental thing that as Christians we have to hang on to. God has promised that he will not alter the thing that's gone out of his mouth. I frequently asked about the Sabbath issue. Well, if God could change the Sabbath, he could just as easily change the plan of salvation. No, the thing that we have to hang on to is the fact that God never changes. Because you see, the law is the transcript of God's character. They're not there to prevent you from enjoying life to its fullest. They're actually there like a guardrail to prevent you from coming into harm in your life. You cannot be a child of God and be disobedient to God's laws. God cannot live inside of you and be disobedient to his own nature. It's impossible. And that is why all throughout the history of the church, every great spiritual awakening and every mighty movement for God has always begun with this consequence of returning to God's truth as found in the pages of the Bible. Great spiritual awakenings have always been marked by obedience to God's commands. This is one of the main lessons that we learn from this continuing story of the Exodus, which we've been exploring now for the last several months. God tells Joshua in chapter 1, verse 3, in the book that bears his name, he says, I will give you every place where you set your feet, as I promised Moses. You remember that 40 years had passed since the children of Israel had been brought out of Egypt by the direct intervention of God. Moses was now dead. But had God changed his mind? No way. Numbers 23 and verse 19 says, does God speak and then not act? Does God promise and not fulfill? No, God always keeps his word. Always, my friends. Why does God always keep his word? Because God cannot lie. When the children of Israel had trusted God and obediently followed him, he had led them out of Egypt. Now God was simply waiting. He was simply waiting for them to demonstrate to him the same trust and obedience that would take them into Canaan. As I was with Moses. What's he mean by that statement? As I was with Moses in his leading your deliverance through my power out of Egypt, I will be with you. Have I not commanded you? That's the question the Lord asked. That is why they were supposed to obey. Why were they supposed to obey? Because God had commanded them to obey. Because God said so. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Is that a truth that's only for the children of Israel? No, it's for all of us, my friends. That's how they were to trust. Because God was with them. That is why that the law is so important to us. It's the why and the how of our own spiritual identity with God. God said so. And my friends, that's all you need to know, because God said so. Why? Because God told me to do that. How? Because God also told me that He's going to be with me wherever we go. Jesus himself demonstrated that same trustful obedience. You'll remember speaking of his Father to his disciples there in that upper room before the crucifixion. He said, I always do what pleases Him. In other words, in all that He did, at any given moment in time, Jesus could say, I did it because my Father told me to. He always relied on His Father. How could Jesus say that? Because in that very same verse there in John chapter 8, Jesus also said, the one who has sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone. In other words, Jesus was saying, because the one who told me is with me, I obey because I trust Him. And He wants us to have that same kind of relationship with Him as He had with His Father. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, go through the camp and tell the people, get your supplies ready. 3 days from now, you will cross the Jordan River to go in and take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you for your own. Joshua 1, verses 10 and 11. Now let me ask you this. How did Joshua expect to accomplish in 3 days what Moses had failed to accomplish in 40 years? Amazing, isn't it? The answer, of course, was quite simple. Without the cooperation of the people, Joshua, he couldn't accomplish anything. But after 40 years of wandering, the children of Israel had finally learned the lesson that God had been trying to teach them all of the time. And the lesson was this. It takes the same kind of obedient faith that got you out of Egypt to get you into Canaan. That was the lesson. God refused to give them their promised inheritance until they had demonstrated to Him faithful obedience. At long last, they had finally learned that lesson. Before crossing the Jordan River into Canaan, Joshua, he sent 2 men to secretly spy out the land, saying, go look the land over, especially the city of Jericho. That was their instructions. However, the mission of these 2 spies did not go undetected. Evidently, the king of Jericho, he must have had an intelligence system that was very similar to our CIA or FBI. Somehow he learned, somehow he discovered that there were spies in the city. And had it not been for the timely intervention of a prostitute, actually a madam, by the name of Rahab, those 2 spies would have been captured and probably killed. Providentially, she hid those 2 spies on the roof of her house. She covered them over with some flax so they couldn't be discovered. And then she uses some misdirection to send the king's searchers on a false trail. As soon as those searchers were gone, however, Rahab went up to the rooftop to tell the spies what were happening. And it was there that those 2 spies, it was there, my friends, that they made a most amazing discovery. For this is what Rahab told them. I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites, east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is a God of heaven above and on earth below. My soul, have you ever stopped to think, what a testimony? From a pagan prostitute? For 40 years, she had had more faith than all of those children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. The spies of Joshua made the startling discovery that for 40 years, the inhabitants of Canaan had actually been a defeated enemy. They'd been quaking in their boots. They had conceded victory to Israel. From the day that they had heard that God had opened up the Red